This is Atomic Biscuits, and I'm your host, BACFA. Welcome everyone to another Atomic Biscuits. This is Atomic Biscuits 20240901 popcorn. The World Health Organization wants you afraid and shaking in your boots. What's this week's scaremongering? Well, it is what is sloth fever, the Oropouche virus, and its symptoms explained. This story starts us off over at cbsnews.com. The Oropouche virus, a potentially fatal disease, also referred to as sloth fever, has made its way to the United States, prompting questions about what Americans should know. On Tuesday, Florida's health department reported 30 cases of Oropouche fever in the state, all linked to travel from Cuba. There has also been one case reported in New York following travel. In an update Tuesday, the CDC said at least 3 of the initial cases reported in the United States were hospitalized, and the agency is currently developing a plan for rapid detection and response to the virus. Earlier this month, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a health advisory to notify clinicians and public health authorities of an increase in the virus. Between January 1st and August 1st, 2024, more than 8,000 cases of Oropouche virus disease were reported, including 2 deaths and 5 cases of vertical transmission associated with fetal death or congenital abnormalities, the CDC alert stated. Adding countries reporting cases include Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Cuba. No evidence of local transmission currently exists within the United States or its territories, the CDC added. How is sloth fever transmitted? Well, the Oropouche virus is spread to people primarily by the bite of infecting biting midges, a type of small fly, and mosquitoes. According to the CDC, the virus is transmitted in forested areas between mosquitoes and non-human vertebrate hosts such as birds, rodents, and sloths, which is where its nickname is derived. Humans then become infected while visiting these areas and can introduce the virus to urban environments. Sloth fever can present similarly to other mosquito-borne diseases like dengue or chikungunya fever, according to the New York State Department of Health, which can make identifying it a challenge. The health department said most often symptoms include fever, chills, headache, muscle aches and pains, joint stiffness. According to the CDC, other symptoms can include sensitivity to light, dizziness, pain behind the eyes, nausea, vomiting, and rash. Symptoms typically last then a week, 2 to 7 days, and can often recur a few days or even weeks later. Most people with Oropouche recover within several days to 1 month, the CDC noted on its website. Some people, fewer than 1 in 20, will develop more serious disease. This includes meningitis, which is inflammation of the membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord, encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, or bleeding. There are no vaccines to prevent or medicines to treat Oropouche, according to the CDC. The best way to protect yourself is avoiding bug bites. You can do this by using insect repellent, using window and door screens, and using a fan outdoors to keep bugs away, the CDC recommends. The CDC is also recommending that pregnant people avoid non-essential travel to areas of infection, including Cuba and Brazil. It's funny how that's also the sort of the nuclear hot spots over here in the Western Hemisphere. I don't know. These symptoms sound kind of familiar. It could be any number of things that the mosquitoes or the midges are causing. We'll have to keep an eye on the Oropouche virus. It's It's ridiculous fear-mongering. This stuff is not even really affecting us here in the States. In most developed countries, our regular sanitation takes care of this stuff. It is the odd case. And notice that it's people who were just traveling in. Why aren't we catching these folks at the border? I also wonder where Fidel's kid has been. He's been kind of floating under the radar. Did he drag this stuff across the border when he was flying back home to Canada? We'll have to just protect ourselves. Everyone, just lock your doors when the sun goes down and don't come out until the dew has burned away. That's what they want. The controllers want you in your cell and the lights off. New Jack Smith indictment against Trump, much like the old one. In an attempt to salvage his prosecution against Donald Trump, special counsel Jack Smith secured a re-indictment Tuesday against the 45th president on 4 felony charges in his Washington, D.C. election interference case. The case revolves around Trump's various challenges to the 2020 election outcome, most notably his effort to prevent Congress from certifying Joe Biden's Electoral College victory on January 6, 2021. The Washington federal grand jury's new 36-page indictment is similar to the previous indictment in the case. However, in early July, the U.S. Supreme Court determined Trump had immunity for actions taken in his official capacity as president. The new indictment is Smith's attempt to recast his case in light of the court's immunity ruling. Similar to the initial August 2023 indictment for election interference, the 4 counts in the indictment are conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, conspiracy against rights. The new Tuesday indictment includes the same 4 criminal charges against Trump from Smith's previous indictment in the same Washington case. However, in an attempt to avoid conflicting with the Supreme Court's immunity ruling, it removes certain specific allegations under the conspiracy to defraud the United States charge that could be considered part of Trump's official presidential capacity, Politico reported. Trump posted first on Truth Social and then to his other social media accounts that deranged Jack Smith is trying to resurrect a dead case and said the charges should be dismissed. Trump's been indicted in 4 separate cases, from election interference to illegally retaining classified documents. He was convicted in May in New York City in the so-called hush money case involving Stormy Daniels. He was also indicted in Fulton County, Georgia, on an election interference case for challenging the outcome of the election in a state Biden carried in 2020. The other case is Smith's classified documents case against Trump in Florida. The new indictment in Washington comes one day after Smith appealed a federal judge's ruling tossing out his Florida classified documents case. In that case, the judge determined that Smith was not legally qualified to prosecute Trump because he was not appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So that's over at dailysignal.com. I gotta say, if you, and it's still not sorted out, if you look at the Georgia election, you've got a ballot system where you have to vote for one party or the other. You have to ask for Republican or Democrat ballot. You can't cross party lines. So tell me, how does Biden take the state while Republican governor and lieutenant governor stay in place? That would require people to vote only for Biden and leave the rest of it blank. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense to anyone, and the truth will eventually come out, I'm sure. FreeBeacon.com, that's the Washington Free Beacon, had the story Biden-Harris administration bars oil drilling on 28 million acres of public lands, reversing Trump actions. Like, they just can't wait for a few months to pass. Alaska senator says state is under attack from Biden-Harris administration. The Biden-Harris administration finalized a decision to block oil and gas development across 28 million acres of public lands in Alaska, reversing a slate of actions taken in the final days of the Trump administration. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland released a statement Tuesday confirming that she would formally revoke 5 public land orders that the agency's then-secretary, David Bernhardt, signed in January of 2021. Those orders removed decades-old restrictions on the massive area, instead returning it to federal multiple-use status and, as a result, allowing the government to open the land up for uses such as recreation, grazing, timber harvesting, mining, and energy development. The restrictions ultimately preserved in the Interior Department's announcement date back to the 1970s and locked the land up for the foreseeable future. Because the Trump administration's January 2021 actions would have reopened the land, Haaland's actions effectively serve as a land withdrawal and are part of the current administration's broader climate agenda, cracking down on oil and gas development. The Trump-era actions would have expanded allowable uses in the Bay, Bering Sea Western Interior, East Alaska, Kobuk Seward Peninsula, and Ring of Fire federal planning areas, but the actions were never fully enforced. In February 2021, shortly after taking office, the Biden-Harris administration postponed Bernhardt's revocation of the public land orders. The Bureau of Land Management was then tasked with assembling an environmental impact statement, assessing the federal government's options on the issue. The Interior Department sub-agency published its final environmental impact statement in early July, recommending that Haaland outright reject the Trump-era orders and maintain restrictions across the 28 million acres of Alaskan land in question. With this action, the Biden administration has wasted an opportunity to do right by Alaska by refusing to lift a single acre of a single public land order anywhere in our state, instead keeping all of these lands in a restricted status, Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican, said at the time. This wouldn't be acceptable in any other state, but this administration is once again treating Alaska differently and far worse than states in the lower 48. Fellow Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan, Republican, added that the recommendations showed their state was under attack by the Biden-Harris administration. Murkowski and Sullivan had called for the land to be opened for multiple uses and for some of it to be transferred to the state government for management. Continuing these essential protections, which have been in place for decades, will ensure continued access and use of these public lands now and in the future, Haaland said in a statement Tuesday, adding that the action was taken after consulting Native American tribes. In addition to the actions finalized Tuesday, the administration has blocked energy development and instituted strict environmental rules governing nearly 70 million acres of public land, mainly targeting Alaska. Most recently, on Earth Day this year, President Biden ordered the Interior Department to lock up 13 million acres of land within Alaska's National Petroleum Reserve. The administration has pursued land restrictions after its attempt to wholesale block all new federal fossil fuel leasing failed judicial review. After taking office in January 2021, Biden issued a moratorium on all new fossil fuel leasing. A federal court then struck the moratorium down as illegal months later, and an appeals court eventually killed it for good. The court rulings forced the administration to continue the federal oil and gas leasing program, but it has done so by blocking off large swaths of land from development and issuing new restrictions on leased land. For example, the Interior Department hiked royalty fees on fossil fuel producers and has refused to hold onshore lease sales on a quarterly basis, a decision that has been subject to industry lawsuits. Again, that's over at freebeacon.com. I gotta say, I wonder, now that the administrative state is coming apart due to new rulings and that the rulemaking has to go back to Congress, how much of this and the EPA and other federal boxes, they're just going to get blown up. They're not going to have the constitutional standing. They're not going to have the force of law to be able to hold these restrictions in place. They're not going to have the authority. So it's going to get interesting in the weeks and months ahead to see how Chevron has affected these rules. Kamala backtracks by supporting bill that would spend hundreds of millions on border wall after condemning Trump's wall plans prior. This is over at One America News Network, OANN.com. Having previously referred to Donald Trump's proposed border wall as a medieval vanity project and a waste of taxpayer money, Kamala Harris has consistently stated that she would halt it. However, Harris has now pledged to sign a bill that would provide hundreds of millions of dollars to continue building a wall along the southern border. Kamala Harris's newfound support for the border wall is the latest flip-flop of many in her fledgling campaign, which just goes to show she's a phony that will do anything to get in power, conservative think tank Vice President Ryan Walker said in a statement. Clearly, Harris wants to distance herself from the Biden-Harris administration's historically awful record at the border. Wasn't she the border czar? Yes, she was. The building materials for Trump's wall have been abandoned and left to rust in border states since the project was abruptly stopped in 2021 when Vice President Harris and President Joe Biden took office. The vice president made the U-turn last Thursday during her speech at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, announcing that she would sign the bipartisan border security package. However, that package requires the Trump border wall, according to GOP Oklahoma Senator James Lankford. It is in the bill itself that it sets the standards that were set during the Trump administration. Here's where it will be built. Here's how it has to be built, the height, the type, everything, during the Trump construction. Later, in response to the surfacing reports on Harris's border measure flip-flop, Trump's team noted in a campaign email that the vice president has never supported securing the nation from illegal immigration. Quote, as a senator, she tried to block President Trump's construction of the border wall, and as border czar, Kamala Harris halted construction of the border wall, the email stated. Maybe if Kamala Harris sat down for an interview, she could explain her views on the border wall. Until then, we can only look to her record of supporting open borders, it concluded. Harris has notoriously refrained from further explaining her campaign's policies. Additionally, the Democrat nominee has also been accused of dodging the press, which gives many the impression that she is too worried about any possible verbal blunders from her end, or perhaps that she doesn't have a strong enough grasp on her own policies to describe them in detail. When you visit the website to Kamala Harris's official campaign, there is no mention of any 2024 campaign policies. Rather, the site only asks for donation money, along with 3 tabs that read, Meet Kamala Harris, Meet Tim Walz, Take Action, and Store, where people can buy merchandise. Trump's aides have questioned how much longer will the mainstream media allow Kamala Harris to hide and use staff to speak on her behalf. It's day 37 of 0 interviews, and Kamala's anonymous campaign sources are now claiming she supports President Trump's border wall. This is a preposterous and false claim. Kamala's record proves she is pro-open border, said Trump Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Prior to her remarks last week, Harris has continuously criticized the border wall plan a number of times. In 2019, Harris announced her bid for the presidency in the primary, referring to Trump's wall as a medieval vanity project. She was adamant that trying to prohibit rapists, gang-affiliated drug and human smugglers, and other violent criminals from a slew of foreign countries, third world countries included, from entering the U.S. would be a waste of time. Trump's border wall is a complete waste of taxpayer money and won't make us any safer, Harris claimed on Facebook in February of 2020. She has also previously maintained that an undocumented immigrant is not a criminal, while showing support for decriminalizing illegal crossings. Yet, at the same as the influx of Venezuelans illegally entering the U.S., Venezuelan security officials in May reported a 25% drop in crime in their country this year, compared with the same period in 2023, according to factcheck.org. As of January, the U.S. had the third largest number of Venezuelan immigrants in the world, 545,000, the Fact Check website continued. Tren de Aragua gang members have also made their way to the United States. The U.S. Border Patrol told CNN in Espanol that 38 potential members of Tren de Aragua were arrested at the border between October 2022 and October 2023, it added. U.S. BP agents in Isleta, Texas, arrested a Venezuelan with no prior criminal history, but with tattoos associated to the Tren de Aragua gang. That was from April 3rd. Watch out for this gang. It is the most powerful in Venezuela, known for murder, drug trafficking, sex crimes, extortion, and other violent acts. This is a tweet from Chief Jason Owens at USBP Chief, dated April 6, 2024. Harris also previously made it clear that she supported providing free health care to migrants and illegal aliens, a move that would have placed a heavy financial load on the American healthcare system. In April 2017, shortly after being elected to the U.S. Senate, she again criticized the Wall project, calling it a stupid use of money. "I will block any funding for it," Harris said. That's over at One America News. That's OANN.com. Texas removes 1 million ineligible voters from voter rolls and fines 30% of non-citizens previously cast ballots. This is over at theblaze.com. The removal process continues. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, Republican, announced Monday that since he signed Senate Bill 1 into law in 2021, the state has removed more than 1 million ineligible voters from its voter rolls. SB 1 aimed to uphold the integrity of elections in Texas by establishing uniform voting hours across the state and banning drive-through voting and unsolicited applications for mail-in ballots. Texas removed from its rolls people who are non-citizens, deceased, or those who had moved out of the state and were no longer residents, according to a press release from Abbott's office. More than 6,500 of those removed from the voter rolls are non-citizens. Abbott's office claimed that 1,930 of those individuals, approximately 30%, had voted in previous elections. The Secretary of State's office is in the process of sending all 1,930 records to the Attorney General's office for investigation and potential legal action, the press release read. Over 6,000 of those removed from Texas voter rolls had felony convictions, 457,000 were deceased, and 463,000 were on the suspense list. The release noted that the removal process is still ongoing. "Election integrity is essential to our democracy," Abbott declared. "I have signed the strongest election laws in the nation to protect the right to vote and to crack down on illegal voting," Abbott stated. "These reforms have led to the removal of over 1 million ineligible people from our voter rolls in the last 3 years, including non-citizens, deceased voters, and people who moved to another state." He continued, "The Secretary of State and the county voter registrars have an ongoing legal requirement to review the voter rolls, remove ineligible voters, and refer any potential illegal voting to the Attorney General's office and local authorities for investigation and prosecution. Illegal voting in Texas will never be tolerated. We will continue to actively safeguard Texans' sacred right to vote while also aggressively protecting our elections from illegal voting." Meanwhile, On Monday, a Texas federal judge placed a temporary 2-week stay on the Biden-Harris administration's Keeping Families Together program, a mass amnesty process for illegal immigrant spouses and stepchildren of American citizens, following a lawsuit filed by 16 Republican-led states, including Texas. According to the White House, there are approximately 550,000 illegal immigrants in the U.S. who could qualify for the program, which would entitle them to parole in place. However, while waiting adjustment of their immigration status, the state's complaint suggests that it could extend mass amnesty to roughly 1.3 million illegal aliens, many of whom have been residing in the country unlawfully for decades. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton said Biden's new parole workaround unilaterally grants the opportunity for citizenship to unvetted aliens whose first act on American soil was to break our laws. This violates the Constitution and actively worsens the illegal immigration disaster that is hurting Texas and our country. Again, that's over at theblaze.com.
I was astonished that Trump didn't declassify him because he promised to during the campaign.
That was Mike Pompeo who did that.
Yeah, and that I talked to President Trump for the first time about that this week. And
what did he say?
He said that Mike Pompeo begged him to, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here.
No,
I think he told the same thing to you.
That's
right?
true.
But he said Mike Pompeo called him and said this would be a catastrophe to release these. You need to not do it.
They've given us an update that they've made 38 arrests and recovered 4 knives. And they said a man believed to be in his 20s has been stabbed. His injuries are not life-threatening. But overall, it's been a really peaceful and enjoyable day for people.
But here was the calculus that ultimately was persuasive for me. All of our internal polling showed from the outset that if I stayed in the Democratic Party, I was going to get Vice President Harris elected. 57 to 60% and even more, sometimes up to 66% of my voters, my followers said that if I withdrew from the election, they were going to vote for Trump, which is ironic, by the way, Tucker, because President Trump and the RNC did nothing to prevent me from being on the ballots. They didn't have a big major organization sending private eyes out. I mean, but the point is, it was weird. It was not smart because I was actually helping the Democrats. And if they just let me stay in and they didn't run this campaign up against me, they probably would win this election. And because I was hurting Trump, oddly, Trump didn't do anything about it. He was kind of, he made a couple of statements about me that I was a communist, etc. They were sort of good-natured, the stuff that you're like, okay, that's okay. They weren't like calling my old girlfriend saying,
Several reported cases of West Nile virus here in New York City so far. Authorities will be out spraying the city tonight and tomorrow. With the mosquito population growing, health officials are warning to remain vigilant. This morning, several towns across the Northeast on alert, some even closing outdoor public areas and issuing voluntary curfews to prevent the spread of potentially dangerous mosquito-borne illnesses. The country's well-known infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, hospitalized after contracting West Nile virus. The 83-year-old now home and expected to make a full recovery. The CDC saying West Nile has been detected in more than 30 states. Experts warning rising temperatures and rainfall are boosting the mosquito population, leading to an increased risk for mosquito-borne infections.
Given the fact that the climate is getting warmer, more and more mosquitoes are outside, so we have to make sure that we're mindful of that.
Right now, in Massachusetts, public health officials declaring 8 communities, including Boston, at high risk for West Nile.
I do have some bug spray if I do notice, and then I'll just zip myself.
Plymouth closing parks and fields at night through September.
We get too much attention from the FBI, the security agencies, wherever we came to the U.S. So to give you an example, last time I was in the U.S., I brought an engineer that is working for Telegram, and there was an attempt to secretly hire my engineer behind my back by cybersecurity officers or agents, whatever they are called.
The U.S. government tried to hire your engineer?
That's my understanding. That's what he told me.
To write code for them or to break into Telegram?
They were curious to learn which open source libraries are integrated to the Telegram's app, on the client side, and they were trying to persuade him to use certain open source tools that he would then integrate into the Telegram's code that, in my understanding, would serve as backdoors.
Would allow the U.S. government to spy on people who use Telegram?
The U.S. government, or maybe any other government, because a backdoor is a backdoor regardless of who is using it.
That's right.
And
that's a little surprising to hear. Maybe it's not surprising. It's offensive. You're confident that happened?
Yes. There is no reason for my engineer to make up the stories. Also because I personally experienced similar pressure in the US. Whenever I would go to the US, I would have two FBI agents greeting me at the airport, asking questions. One time I was having my breakfast at like 9 a.m. and the FBI showed up at my house that I was renting. And that was quite surprising. And I thought, we're getting too much attention here. It's probably not the best environment to run.
Why would had you committed a crime?
No. They were interested to learn more about Telegram. They knew I, left Russia. They knew what we were doing, but they wanted details. And my understanding is that they wanted to establish a relationship to kind of, in a way, control Telegram better. I understand that they were doing their job. It's just that for us running a privacy-focused social media platform, that probably wasn't the best environment to be. And we want to be focused on what we do, not on government relations of that sort.
Democrats boast prisoners are voting, but feds say they don't know how many. This is over at dailysignal.com. Federal government officials have promoted voter registration and voting for prison inmates that might be inconsistent or outright violate state laws on prisoner voting and restoration of felons' voting rights, legal experts say. As the Daily Signal has reported, an executive order signed in 2021 by President Joe Biden directs every federal agency to help boost voter registration and turnout, including the Justice Department and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In a letter earlier this year, Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee asserted hundreds of individuals inside federal prisons have successfully registered and voted in recent elections. Asked Tuesday how many federal prisoners have voted and where, a Federal Bureau of Prisons spokesperson told the Daily Signal that information is not available to this office. That same letter from Senate Democrats to Attorney General Merrick Garland and Bureau of Prisons Director Colette Peters called for the Biden-Harris administration to do more to ensure voting or future voting by those currently incarcerated. Generally, states haven't revoked voting rights as a result of misdemeanor convictions. Only Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia allow incarcerated felons to vote, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. In 10 states, felons lose their voting rights indefinitely after being convicted for some crimes. 25 other states have varying procedures for restoring voting rights to convicted felons who have served their sentences. The Federal Bureau of Prisons will likely register non-qualified voters. Ken Cuccinelli, national chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative, told the Daily Signal, any inmate outside of Maine, Vermont, or Washington, D.C. is not legally qualified to vote. Cuccinelli, a former Virginia Attorney General, has advocated criminal justice reforms and procedures to restore voting rights after a convict has served his or her sentence. But he said he lacks confidence in a federal agency's ability to follow each state's standard in a mass voter registration drive. States have very different laws and procedures for restoring voting rights for convicted felons, and I don't seriously believe that the Federal Bureau of Prisons will keep those differences straight, Cuccinelli said. Federal Bureau of Prisons had informed inmates about voting before Biden's Executive Order 14019, agency spokesperson Randalee Giamusu said. The FBOP recognizes that voter registration education and the facilitation of registering eligible voters is a valuable exercise of American democracy and an important facet of successful re-entry into the community, Giamuso told the Daily Signal in a written statement. Giamuso said that the agency's press office doesn't have information on how many federal inmates were registered and voted in recent elections, as described in the Senate Democrats' letter in March. Since at least August 2020, FBOP has made general information on voting rights available to all individuals in its custody at the time of admission and prior to release, Giamuso said. The information FBOP provides includes which districts allow incarcerated individuals to vote and any restrictions in their state that may have placed them on their ability to vote. The Justice Department claimed presidential privilege in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit by the Foundation for Government Accountability to obtain information on Biden's executive order. There is very little about this executive order that doesn't appall me, Cuccinelli said of Biden's order. They have hidden everything and are evading the Freedom of Information Act. The Federal Bureau of Prisons could be in violation of state laws, contends former Justice Department lawyer Hans Van Spakovsky, who now manages the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. Federal officials who are registering people to vote in prisons have no idea if it's legal in the state where that prisoner resides, Von Spakovsky, also a senior legal fellow at Heritage, told the Daily Signal. What are the prisoners supposed to do when a government official says, "Here, you can vote"? Federal Bureau of Prison officials could be helping to violate state laws. Von Spakovsky authored a Heritage report published Friday about Biden's executive order that included information about the Bureau of Prisons. It says, in part, the executive order specifically directed the Attorney General of the United States to facilitate voter registration and voting for all eligible individuals in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, despite the fact that such eligibility is determined by state law governing the circumstances under which felons can vote. Federal officials in the Bureau of Prisons lack the knowledge, training, and authority to make such eligibility determinations. The U.S. Marshals Service was ordered to include such requirements in all intergovernmental agreements and jail contracts, von Spakowski writes in the report. In other words, state and local jails and prisons that house prisoners at the request of the federal government would have to register prisoners to vote and assist them in casting absentee ballots, the report continues. It adds, in the 3 jurisdictions that allow incarcerated felons to vote, Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia, those individuals, along with others who are in jail awaiting trial or are serving a misdemeanor sentence, can register to vote and cast a ballot on their own through the mail. No assistance is required from the federal or state and local prison officials. A lawsuit filed by 9 Republican state attorneys general challenges the constitutionality of Biden's electioneering and executive order, specifically referring to prisoner voting. The lawsuit argues that Garland, as U.S. Attorney General, is registering imprisoned felons to vote, but there was never notice nor comment on that policy to allow the public to weigh in on whether that is right. And in many states, felon voting is illegal, the lawsuit by state attorneys general says, because the U.S. Attorney General failed to follow neutral processes. The likelihood of potential conflicts between federal action and state laws is heightened. Again, that's over at dailysignal.com. TheRegister.com has Facebook whistleblower calls for transparency in social media AI. Frances Haugen says, navigating the digital world requires a North Star. Frances Haugen, a transparency and accountability advocate known for blowing the whistle on Facebook, believes the tech industry needs to find a North Star to navigate through ethical and privacy risks. Speaking at the Data Grail Summit in Half Moon Bay, California, Haugen drew a metaphorical parallel between the moral drift seen at technology companies and the frequent shipwrecks that occurred from the 16th century until around 1736, when John Harrison developed the first reliable maritime timekeeper for the measurement of longitude. Haugen knows well that the North Star can be used to calculate latitude and not longitude. Her point is that steering an economy based on intangible things like software and financial services requires a different set of guiding principles and safety practices than those that evolved from the tangible risks of the industrial era. The reason why 1 in 5 ships was disappearing on the way to India from 1550 to 1650 was because when we drift, the consequences are really serious, said Haugen. The intangible economy opens up another opportunity for us to drift off course because when we stop having absolute references, we end up in a very similar situation. As an example, Haugen cited her experience at Facebook. Over the years I spent at Facebook, I realized that over and over again Facebook was facing trade-offs, she said, with regard to content moderation. These trade-offs were invisible to me, and Facebook staff had learned to not see there were implicit choices, but every time they resolved those, because of the corporate culture, they would end up on the side of profits instead of optimizing what was good for people, Haugen noted. To correct our course, she argues for a way to measure, navigate, and understand the world of social media, AI models, and other aspects of the unseen digital world. Most social media platforms have no transparency metrics, Haugen pointed out. How do we actually compare between these products? The question is, as we move from a world that we can inspect, that we can all agree exists, to a world where we can't agree what it is, where we all see a different thing, how to do our safety rituals needs to change. Haugen said that part of the reason that car companies don't cut corners on safety is that they know people can conduct independent crash tests to assess vehicle safety. In a world where we can't inspect the system, we don't have those same rituals of safety. Underscoring her point is the decision by her former employer, rebranded as Meta in a bid to shed its scandal-prone past, to discontinue its transparency tool CrowdTangle. And that's to say nothing of recent claims by social media researchers in Brazil that Meta's attorneys tried to discredit reporting on scam ads, the resistance of other social media platforms to scrutiny and accountability or political pressure on academic researchers. When we look at most big tech companies, the only expectation we have on transparency and clarity is around profit and loss numbers, said Haugen. Instead, she suggests companies can do more to promote data transparency and governance, and they will have to do more to accommodate the evolving data privacy laws. Haugen pointed to the more than 40 states suing Meta over alleged harm to children and related incidents as the catalyst for further legislation. We can work together, she urged. We can shape a future that is going to work for all of us, where we're not afraid to innovate, where we're able to move forward and make the most impact out of these technologies. That's over at theregister.com. I wanted to dip into this article. It's too long to include the entire thing, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a teaser. It's over at theburningplatform.com, and it's titled Countdown to Crisis, Catastrophe, and Collapse. Trying to decipher the path ahead becomes more difficult by the day. We are purposefully bombarded with misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda by the ruling class designed to distract us from their real purpose, real agenda, and real plans to imprison us in their techno-gulag, eating the bugs in our container-sized hovels, using our government-issued CBDCs to subsist unless we dared to question the approved narrative, resulting in our social credit rating dropping into the domestic terrorist zone, getting us banned and shunned from society. This is the New World Order the Davos crowd has designed and will implement as a great reset, if they succeed, in retaining and increasing control over the United States and the rest of the Western world in the next 6 months. I know many bloggers/analysts depend on clicks, likes, and subscriptions to their websites or social media to make a living, so they constantly predict Armageddon within the next week, and it never happens. This little boy who cried wolf routine has resulted in even the critical thinking among us becoming complacent and unconcerned as we accelerate towards our dire rendezvous with destiny. We shrug off Ukraine invading Russia and bombing a nuclear power plant, while Belarus moves troops toward the Ukraine border, Putin bombs Kiev, and U.S. military equipment is employed by U.S. military personnel against Russia. We discount the possibility of Iran actually mounting a devastating response against Israel, prompting an even larger response by Israel, and the U.S. getting drawn into the conflict with Iran because we've been here before and nothing happened. And nothing may happen again in the next week. But fourth turnings never de-intensify. There will be blood, death, and war on an enormous scale before this crisis is resolved. Personally, I believe the next 6 months will determine the course of humanity for the next century and beyond. I don't think that is hyperbole when you step back and observe the big picture. It's so easy to get lost in the inconsequential minutia because they want you lost in the inconsequential minutia, while the consequential decision-making is being done by the billionaire puppet masters behind closed doors. This fourth turning is slated to reach its bloody denouement in or around 2032 based upon historical precedent. Of course, with nuclear arms, it could all end in the blink of an eye. We are in an existential battle between good and evil, and unlike the movies, there is no guarantee the good guys will win in the end. We are lost in a blizzard of lies, with super elite factions vying for power and control over our lives. People who just want to be left alone to live their lives in peace with the freedom to say and do what they want are being bullied, tyrannized, surveilled, censored, taxed, and pushed to their limit by those pulling the levers of this society. Most people are unwilling or unable to confront the brutal facts of our current reality. They cling to their normalcy bias, disbelieving and minimizing the unmistakable catastrophic threats staring them right in the face. As James Stockdale stated many decades ago, you can't confuse faith, we will overcome the evil forces we are confronting, with the discipline and tremendous sacrifices we will have to make in order to achieve victory over those evil forces. The normalcy bias crowd with their heads planted firmly in the sand, will not be able to sit out this chaotic, violent, bloody installment of the fourth turning crisis. Sides must be taken. Choices must be made. Engaging in distressing behavior will be required. The Second Amendment will need to be used in order to retain the First Amendment. If ever Lenin's quote, "There are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happened," applied, it has been the 6 weeks since the deep state/invisible government attempted to assassinate Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. Events have been happening at a breakneck pace, and it is difficult to determine which incidents are being engineered and which are occurring naturally. As a dyed-in-wool conspiracy theorist who needs new conspiracy theories because all of mine have come true, I believe most of what we've witnessed over the last several weeks has been engineered by competing super-elite factions vying for control over our government in a life-or-death struggle to rule over our demise as an empire in the throes of its death rattle. As Dylan noted in the 1960s, times are a-changin'. The waters of debt have grown, and we are sinking like a stone. With the national debt already above $35 trillion, generating $1.1 trillion of interest expense per year, our leaders continue to heap $6 billion of debt per day, $4.2 million per minute, upon our backs, destroy our standard of living through relentless Fed-created inflation, wage undeclared wars across the globe, unblinkingly report provably false economic data to maintain their Potemkin empire facade, conspire with the Fed and their Wall Street owners to push the stock market to all-time highs before they pull the rug out at a time of their choosing. They know the ignorant masses are disinterested and or incapable of understanding the machinations they use to keep the sheep calm as they lead them to slaughter. Last week, they quietly reported that 818,000 jobs they reported as existing were entirely fake. They knew they were fake when they reported them, but you got to do what you got to do to maintain your wealth, control, and power. A good rule of thumb is whatever the government reports as the unemployment rate or inflation rate, double it to get close to the real number. Using real numbers would reveal the country is in a recession and has been for over a year. You should always watch what they do rather than what they say to understand the truth. Anyway, this is quite a long article. It's really good. I'd encourage you to go over and check it out. It's Countdown to Crisis, Catastrophe, and Collapse over at theburningplatform.com. Having Robert F. Kennedy Jr. endorse Trump and work with him has drawn new attention to health. It's the injected crisis and some other things. I don't agree with everything he has to say. He's quite liberal. But the fact that he threw himself behind Trump and is bringing people who are focused on vaccinations and other health issues into the fray, and that he believes that Trump is the better of the two paths forward for those who are paying attention to that, is not insignificant. It affected the entire world. This story over at ZeroHedge.com, parents fight back with rising use of religious vaccine exemptions for their children. This is by Tyler Durden. I don't think that's his real name. Summer has officially come to a close. Families wrapped up beach and or mountain vacations last weekend as kids now sit in the classroom, hopefully learning non-woke math and critical reading skills. A notable trend this year is the increasing number of parents choosing to circumvent government-enforced vaccine requirements for their children through non-medical religious exemptions. Local nonprofit media outlet Maryland Matters cited new data showing an increasing number of parents have opted their children out of vaccination requirements through non-medical religious exemption. The trend surged after draconian requirements pushed by an overreaching government during the COVID era. Here's more on the data from Maryland Matters. The number rarely rises above 1% or 2% of an incoming kindergarten class, typically accounting for no more than a couple hundred children per year, but that means that in the years since 2002, a total of more than 10,000 kindergartners have attended public and private schools without vaccination records, according to historical data from the Maryland Department of Health. The rising percent of religious exemptions in recent years may point to increasing rates of vaccine hesitancy among families, said Daniel Salmon, a professor and director of the Institute for Vaccine Safety at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We've seen a post-COVID increase, Salmon said. With COVID, things got really polarized, with more misinformation and disinformation. Vaccinations became a very political topic, and that's not helpful. Maryland law requires doctors to inject children with several big pharma vaccines before they enter kindergarten, and many more after, to protect themselves and their classmates from transmissible diseases such as polio, measles, and chickenpox, among many others. Tracking vaccine hesitancy through the Maryland health data suggests parents are becoming increasingly aware of the potential concerns surrounding increasing government-mandated vaccinations for their children. Here's a straightforward breakdown of the vaccine hesitancy rise of Maryland parents via the media outlet. The earliest data readily available from the state is from the 2002-2003 school year, in which 0.2% of kindergartners got a religious exemption, or about 126 kids out of roughly 63,000 entering kindergarten that year. The rate increased steadily over the years. 10 years later, for example, about 0.6% of kids had religious exemptions, resulting in about 419 kids not receiving vaccinations in 2012 to 2013. Religious exemptions spiked in 2019 to 2020 when 2.7% of kindergartners, or 1,641 kids, opted out of vaccination requirements. The COVID-19 pandemic went into full swing in the spring of 2020, so those families would have opted out prior to the rise in cases in the United States. Since the 2021-2022 school year, at least 1% of kindergartners in Maryland had a medical exemption, a couple hundred a year. Perhaps the expanding vaccine schedule for kids over the last 3 decades has something to do with the vaccine hesitancy among millennial parents. Axios shared a nationwide breakdown of where parents have used non-medical exemptions for their children the most. It's an infographic of the United States that you can see over at zerohedge.com. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump criticized the number of childhood vaccines in a video with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in mid-July. There's a post here from X that has the video as well. The prevailing trend is that increasing numbers of parents are opting their children out of government-mandated big pharma vaccines. We wonder why, and maybe Trump is right. There's a lot of data here for you to see over at zerohedge.com. Well, that's all the time we have for this week on Atomic Biscuits. I hope you have a wonderful week. Stay close to the news. I kind of think we're going to have some wild stuff happening this week. It's a holiday week for those of us here in the United States, and so that means a lot of travel on the roads, a lot of airplanes in the sky, a lot of stuff going on. So I just think it would behoove all of us to keep our heads on a swivel and keep our feet on the ground. See you next week for Atomic Biscuits. So long, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for Atomic Biscuits. Tune in again next week for more news and music. Check out BACFA on Gab at BACFA, as well as BitChute, Rumble, D-Live and Odyssey. Check out LastScoutRadio.com for fun content. Listen to WBN 324 on radio stations around the world, on many streaming platforms, and World Broadcasting Network WBN 324.zil.